capital,
terrorism,
capital.
Domestic terrorism, radical ideology, Al-Qaeda, terrorism,
Capital, domestic terrorism.
political purposes, no in the crowd,
7, they can take part in domestic terrorism,
domestic terrorism, terrorism, domestic terrorism,
domestic terrorism,
terrorist, capital, domestic terrorist, capital, domestic terrorism, domestic terrorist, domestic terrorism, capital,
terrorism,
domestic terrorism, domestic terrorism, capital, domestic terrorism, terrorist,
Capital.
domestic terrorism, generally talk,
terrorism,
domestic terrorism,
capital.